A hush grips the flight line as a new silhouette crawls out of the Pacific haze. Big shoulders, blunt nose, thick wings that look all wrong for a knife fight in the sky. Enemy spotters crack jokes about a fat American mistake, but 30 days from this moment those same voices will be sending last letters home. The machine they're mocking, the F6F Hellcat, will flip the story of the air war in the Pacific, smashing records, shattering doctrines, and turning unbeatable aces into targets. If you want the full jaw-dropping truth behind how a so-called clumsy fighter posted a kill ratio near 19-1, settle in. And before we dive, do one small thing that keeps epic history alive here. Tap subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of these hidden World War II stories. Also, tell me in the comments where you're watching. I love seeing this community stretch from Manila to Munich to Milwaukee. The reason this story matters is simple. It proves that in modern war, the winner isn't always the one with the lightest plane, the tightest turn, or the flashiest ace. Sometimes the winner is the side that builds a system so strong and so well coordinated that individual brilliance can't beat it. For 2 years, Japan's A6M Zero ruled the sky. It was fast, it was agile, and it seemed to bend physics. American, British, Dutch, pilots across the Pacific learned to fear it. The Zero's early record shows why. At Pearl Harbor, Japan lost. Fewer than 30 aircraft while hundreds of American machines burned. In the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, kill counts tilted so far one way that Allied commanders started to wonder if the very idea of air superiority had changed forever. Veteran Japanese pilots even said the Zero felt less like a machine and more like wings you could wear. Responsive, elegant, almost telepathic. Now picture the other side of the table. U.S. intelligence hears whispers of a new Navy fighter in the pipeline. A beast with armor plates, bulletproof glass, self-sealing tanks, and a huge radial engine that drinks fuel like a freight train. It weighs roughly twice as much as the Zero. To a pilot raised on tight, graceful dogfighting, that sounds like a bad joke. And inside Japanese operations tents from Rabaul to Truk, the laughter is loud. Their logic feels airtight. A heavy aircraft can't outturn a Zero. Therefore, it can't win. But the Hellcat was never built to win a contest the Zero had already mastered. It was built to change the rules of the contest. Here's the problem the Zero couldn't escape. Its brilliance came from ruthless weight savings. Engineers shaved. Grams everywhere. No armor for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, often not even a radio in the cockpit. The result was a featherweight fighter that could slice through air and pivot on a dime. But what happens when bullets actually hit? When fuel lines puncture and ignite? When a single burst tears through the cockpit because there's no plate to stop it? Those omissions, brilliant in 1941, became fatal by 1943, because the Hellcat didn't meet the Zero on style points. It met it with energy, altitude, teamwork, and firepower measured in math instead of romance. Think of energy fighting like this. Altitude is a kind of money in the bank, and speed is cash in your pocket. The Hellcat carried more of both. When a Zero tried to lure it into a flat-turning fight, the F6F simply didn't play. It climbed away, thousands of feet per minute on the brute strength of a Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower monster. Then it came down in a slashing pass, 650 caliber Brownings spitting heavy rounds at such velocity that one clean burst could stitch a Zero from spinner to tail. Before the Zero could swing around for that glorious turning shot, the Hellcat had already zoomed back up, converting speed into altitude, resetting the chessboard. Over and over, pass after pass, the same cold arithmetic. Dive, fire, climb, reset. No pretty spiral duels, no long knife edge pirouettes, just execution. The first time Japanese pilots met this method, they were bewildered. Their training said American fighters would try to turn. If you held your nerve, you would get on their tail. Except these new blue-gray shapes didn't turn. They went vertical. When a Zero tried to follow, its airspeed bled away and the Hellcat snapped into a hammerhead at the top, swinging its nose through the sky and dropping in behind like a guillotine blade. Pilots wrote stunned after-action notes. The American opened fire from 400 meters. 6 guns, not 4. The volume of fire was unreal. I took hits in a heartbeat. Some limped home full of holes. Many didn't, but the Hellcat's edge wasn't just raw muscle. It was being flown as part of a machine larger than any single aircraft. Radar stations at sea steering fighters toward incoming raids. Controllers vectoring divisions to the perfect altitude with the sun at their backs. Radios chattering clean instructions across elements and pairs. The Zero's designers had treated radios as excess weight. The Hellcat treated them like oxygen. One veteran Japanese leader briefed his squadron in late '43 with grim clarity. "Forget the duel. You're facing a network. We fly like solo samurai. They fight like a factory with wings." This shift came right as the Japanese pilot pipeline started to run dry. Before the war, the Imperial Navy trained aviators like master craftsmen, multi-year programs, hundreds of flight hours, serious aerobatics and gunnery. Only the best graduated. Those men tore through the early campaigns. But after Midway, attrition and fuel shortages gutted that system. By early 1944, brand new Navy pilots showed up with a fraction of the hours, some with barely any live fire experience because there wasn't ammunition to waste in training. In the same months, American pilots are climbing into Hellcats with around 300 hours, including time and type, plus relentless carrier landing practice and thousands of rounds fired on the range. If you're keeping score on the ground, before the fight even starts, that discrepancy is the ballgame. Watch how these threads snap together. October '43, U.S. carriers strike Wake Island. Zeros pounce from above with the advantage. Altitude, numbers, surprise. The book says the attackers should feast. The Hellcats do the opposite of what the book expects. Locked formations, controlled dives, energy preserved, no panicked turn fighting. When the Zeros spray at long range hoping for a lucky hit, the U.S. planes simply eat the fire, armor behind the pilot, self-sealing tanks around the fuel, tough plumbing around oil systems. When the Japanese guns click dry, the Hellcats light the afterburner in spirit and go to work. Dive, fire, climb, rhythm, timing, teamwork. 8 Zeros fall. The Americans lose none. On paper, that's a single skirmish. In reality, it's a live demonstration. Your doctrine is dead, ours is just starting. From that point on, the carriers stop behaving like delicate daggers that must strike first and run. They start acting like floating fortresses, a word U.S. commanders began using without irony. With Hellcat umbrellas overhead, task forces park off enemy coastlines for days, even weeks. Let them come. Radar will spot them at 150 miles. Controllers will stack the intercepts by altitude band. Vectors will put Hellcats with the sun behind them and gravity on their side. And those fat American fighters, so heavy, so wrong, that will simply take the fight apart and put it back together on their own terms. You can feel the morale shift even in language. Japanese pilots coin a dark joke about Hellcat sickness. The dread that creeps in when you realize the silhouette you mocked has the power to dictate whether you live to see evening. More. Planners like Minoru Genda, who helped script the triumph at Pearl Harbor, review Hellcat specifications and shrug them off as more American overbuilding. Too much armor, too much fuel, too much bulk. Then the reports stack up from Rabaul, the Marshalls, the Marianas. 6 guns, heavy hits, vertical tactics, perfect timing, radar-guided ambushes. What looked like excess turns out to be exactly enough. Let's talk numbers because numbers cut through pride. A Zero's 7.7mm machine guns fling light bullets at modest speed, fine for tearing fabric and aluminum, but not for chewing through armor plates or rupturing tough, self-sealed tanks. A Hellcat 650 caliber Brownings pour out something like 4,500 rounds per minute in total. Each slug is heavy, fast, and mean. It carries shocking energy. When those streams connect, they don't dent, they carve. Add in the computing gun sights that arrive later, helping pilots lead a target precisely, and you've got short, disciplined bursts that erase an airplane in a heartbeat. The technology gap stretches beyond guns and engines. American logistics is quietly choreographing a lethal dance. Fully interchangeable parts for the R2800 engine, maintenance crews swapping components without hand fitting, factories producing airframes like clockwork, one new Hellcat rolling off the Bethpage line roughly every hour at peak. It's not just that the U.S. can build more. It's that the U.S. can build the same, again and again with the same performance, the same reliability, the same quirks crews learn and master. Meanwhile, Japanese mechanics are hand-tuning engines, because no two are exactly alike, fighting shortages of fuel and rubber and metals and making impossible decisions about which few aircraft get scarce spares. When the big tests come, those quiet advantages roar. Early 1944, Formosa. Japanese leaders throw hundreds of planes into the path of U.S. fast carriers proclaiming huge victories by radio. Dozens of ships sunk, waves of bombers blasted. Gun camera film tells the real story back home. American losses are a fraction of the claims, while Japanese squadrons are gutted and the last seasoned pilots are gone. With the bench emptied, green air crews fly into the same Hellcat-built meat grinder and learn the hard way that courage, without training and agility without altitude, are not enough. The time the Pacific War pivots to the Marianas, the script is written. Radar picks up the inbound raids. Controllers stack the intercept by tiers. Hellcats ride high, sun at their back, lines tidy, radios alive. Japanese fighters arrive already behind in energy and awareness, trying to climb into a sky the Americans have divided like a grid. Zones covered, roles assigned, timing planned. The clash lasts minutes. Dozens of attackers vanish. The nickname that U.S. pilots coined that day is cruel but honest. A turkey shoot. It sticks because it feels true. None of this is to say the Hellcat wins on machinery alone. It wins because pilots are trained to use the machine in a specific way and disciplined enough to stick to that method when instinct begs for a turn, a chase, a flashy single combat kill. The doctrine sounds boring. Its results are anything but. Close escort covers bombers directly. High cover hunts diving threats. Weave patterns keep eyes and guns where they need to be. If a temptingly vulnerable enemy flashes under the formation, the doctrine says hold your lane, protect the mission. That's hard when adrenaline hits. It's also the difference between an intact strike group and a mess of scattered fighters everyone can pick off at will. By late 44, Japanese commanders understand exactly what they're facing, yet can't conjure a countermeasure because the foundation they'd need is gone. Time to train, fuel to fly, experienced leaders to pass down nuance. The culture piece bites hard too. The Hellcat's whole philosophy says don't fight when you're disadvantaged. Break, climb, reset, strike on your own terms. For pilots steeped in Bushido, raised to see withdrawal as shame and sacrifice as virtue, that mindset is hard to adopt even when logic says it's survival. And so, again and again, they turn with a plane that can't keep energy, chase when they should climb, and fall into the path of those 6 heavy guns. The result, written coldly in tallies, is staggering. Across the Pacific, Hellcats down enemy aircraft by the thousands, over 5,000 credited by war's end, with only a few hundred lost in aerial combat. Some U.S. Navy pilots rack up ace-in-a-day tallies, and the numbers feel almost unreal until you map them onto the system behind them. Intelligence, radar vectoring, altitude, energy, teamwork, and the industrial muscle to keep the line of fighters fresh and the spare parts flowing. None of this works if the plane can't take punishment. The Hellcat can. Armor weighs a lot, so American engineers don't pretend otherwise. They add it anyway, over the pilot's spine and head, around oil lines, wrapping the fuel in self-sealing bladders that swell when hit to smother flames. The cost is weight. The payoff is pilots who walk away and climb back into a cockpit tomorrow. That's the resource loop industrial war runs on. Keep your veterans alive and their experience compounds. Your tactics sharpen, your formations crisp up, your debriefs have teeth, your losses fall. The other side, losing seasoned flyers faster than it can replace them, hits the opposite curve. Skills thin out, mistakes multiply, training cuts corners, and fear creeps in. There's one more truth tucked inside the Hellcat's wrong look. Big, blunt, and tough isn't a design mistake when you're fighting from carriers. Naval aviation punishes fragile machines. Hard deck impacts, crosswinds, abrupt wave-offs, cramped maintenance, salt air everywhere. The F6F is built to live in that environment. Its big wing and stout landing gear forgive rough traps. Its engine likes the abuse. Its systems are simple enough to fix with skinned knuckles at sea. When a deck crew can turn a bird around fast and trust it to come back, tempo rises. When tempo rises, the carrier stops being a tool you hide and becomes a hammer you swing. That transformation, as much as any dogfight, is why the Hellcat matters. So when you hear a veteran say, "The Zero was a superb fighter, the Hellcat was a superior weapon system," that's what they mean. The Zero was a brilliant individual. The Hellcat was the spine of a team, wired into radar, fed by factories, flown by pilots drilled to a sharp edge and told to follow a plan that didn't flatter the ego but crushed the enemy. It's not as romantic as the lone duel. It's how wars are won. This is just the opening arc of the story, the part where pride meets physics, where sleek meets stubborn, where doctrine shifts and the scoreboard starts to flip. In the next part, we'll step through the turning points that made impossible outcomes feel inevitable. The radar-guided ambushes that felt like traps from another world. The giant fleet battles where formations of Hellcats sheared entire strikes out of the sky. And the grim moment when Japan, out of trained pilots and out of time, turned to suicide attacks, and still the Hellcats held the line. If that sounds like a history lesson you can feel in your gut, make sure you've subscribed, because this series is built to pull you into the cockpit, engine roar in your ears, tracer fire in your periphery, and the cold calculus that decides who gets to see the ocean again. The laughter around those Pacific airfields didn't fade all at once. It died the way a flame sputters, fed by pride until it meets the wind of reality. The first few dogfights were supposed to be routine, easy hunts, yet when the Zeros turned into their graceful spirals and dove to attack, they met a fighter that didn't behave like anything they had faced before. The Hellcat didn't run, didn't twist into acrobatics, and it climbed. Straight up, powerful, deliberate, like an engine tearing through gravity itself. Japanese pilots who had spent years mastering the art of tight turns suddenly realized their elegance meant nothing against sheer power. They tried to follow the Hellcat's vertical move and felt their airspeed drain, their controls go soft, and the world begin to spin. By the time they stabilized, the American fighter had flipped over, diving down in a perfect hammerhead, 6 heavy guns already blazing. Those guns spat a storm unlike anything the Pacific had seen. The Browning .50 caliber stitched the sky with light, each round fast enough to punch through metal and bone. Each burst so dense it sounded like thunder. Pilots who once mocked the Americans' clumsy machines suddenly watched their own wings vanish in sheets of fire. One pilot wrote later, "The Hellcat's guns roared like a monster's breath. I turned, but I was too slow. My comrade disappeared in flames. I never saw him again." That was the moment the myth of Japanese invincibility began to crack. For 2 long years, the Zero had been untouchable. It ruled the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea, its pilots artists of death who fought with the grace of swordsmen. But art doesn't survive contact with industry, and the Hellcat wasn't built for beauty, and it was built to win. It carried armor that made it look heavy but kept its pilots alive. It carried radios that added weight but connected entire fleets like a single mind. And most importantly, it carried lessons. Every inch of the aircraft whispered the memory of earlier losses. Each rivet a small promise that the mistakes of 1942 would never repeat. At sea, the Americans had found their rhythm. Radar stations glowed with ghostly green pings, controllers speaking calmly into headsets as dots appeared hundreds of miles away. Contact. Bearing 150. Angels 20. Within minutes, divisions of Hellcats peeled off into perfect formations, climbing toward the sun with geometry that felt mechanical in its precision. Pilots didn't need to search for the enemy. They were guided to them. This was war run by mathematics, and in that equation, the Zero was already behind. From below, Japanese pilots watched in confusion. How did these lumbering fighters know exactly where to be? Why did their formations never break even when the first shots were fired? The answer wasn't magic, it was coordination. The Americans had built a war machine that stretched from factory floor to flight deck to cockpit. Every pilot in the air was backed by thousands of unseen hands. Engineers, machinists, mechanics, radar operators, all working as one. The Hellcat wasn't just a plane. It was the visible tip of an industrial iceberg. Beneath the waves lay the system that made it unstoppable. By the end of 1943, the Zero's weaknesses were no longer secrets. Its lack of armor, its unprotected fuel tanks, its fragile frame. All the sacrifices made for speed now looked like fatal wounds. The Hellcat could take hit after hit and keep flying. Its pilots landed on carriers with wings full of bullet holes, oil leaking, paint scorched black, and then they went right back up the next day. That kind of resilience demoralized an enemy who fought for honor above survival. To the Japanese, retreat was shame. To the Americans, retreat was strategy. They didn't fight duels. They fought campaigns. Inside briefing tents across Rabaul and Truk, frustration grew. Reports came back describing a new kind of combat. Fights that didn't last minutes but seconds, decided not by skill but by position and speed. Lieutenant Commander Tanemizu, one of Japan's most respected aces, told his pilots, "Forget everything you know. The Americans no longer fight our fight. They strike from above, they climb when we turn, and when we chase, we die." It was a confession of doom wrapped in discipline. Even Japan's best pilots were realizing the truth. The Hellcat didn't need to be beautiful to be perfect. But the real tragedy wasn't in tactics, it was in training. Before the war, Japan's aviators were forged through years of preparation. They flew hundreds of hours, mastered aerobatics, navigation, and formation flying until it became instinct. They were elite warriors, each a craftsman of the sky. Then came Midway, then Guadalcanal, and one by one those craftsmen vanished. The Imperial Navy replaced them with boys, brave, willing, but unprepared. Training hours dropped from hundreds to mere dozens. Ammunition was so scarce that pilots practiced firing only in their imagination. By 1944, some had never even fired their guns in flight until the first time they faced a Hellcat. On the other side, American pilots were being molded in a system that didn't just teach flying, it engineered excellence. Flight schools drilled them for months, feeding them a diet of precision and practice. They fired thousands of rounds on the range. They trained for carrier landings until their muscles knew the routine better than their minds. Their aircraft were standardized, their engines interchangeable. Where Japan had art, America had repetition. And repetition builds mastery faster than inspiration ever could. As the war moved toward Formosa, the difference became catastrophic. Japanese commanders launched massive counterstrikes, claiming dozens of American ships sunk. But when the gun camera footage came back, the truth was stark. Out of hundreds of Japanese aircraft sent, most never returned. Only a handful of American planes were lost. The rest of the sky was filled with smoke trails curling toward the sea. A surviving pilot would later write, "We rose to meet the Americans, but they were already waiting. They knew our direction, our altitude, our number. It was not combat. It was execution." In the span of months, Japan's air power went from dominance to desperation. The Hellcat's arrival was like the turning of a tide no one could stop. Every statistic told the same story. The Americans weren't just winning. They were rewriting the rules of aerial warfare. Kill ratios that had once favored Japan now flipped completely. The Hellcat achieved 19 victories for every one loss. That number isn't legend. It's data, recorded and verified. And behind every one of those numbers was a pilot who trusted a system more than instinct, a machine more than myth. And still, the most haunting part wasn't the losses. It was the silence afterward. Across shattered runways, the airfields that once buzzed with the sound of Zeros now lay quiet. Planes rusted in the tropical rain. Mechanics stared at empty fuel drums. Pilots walked among burned-out wrecks, their reflections caught in twisted metal. They had once laughed at the Hellcat, that heavy, ugly beast of a machine. But now they understood. Its bulk wasn't a flaw. It was a promise. Every pound of armor, every gallon of fuel, every round of ammunition spoke of a country that refused to send its sons into battle unprotected. The Hellcat's arrival marked something larger than victory. It marked the moment modern war changed forever. Japan's airmen had been trained to fight as individuals, to seek glory through skill. The Americans fought as a system. Every plane, every pilot, every radar operator, every mechanic formed a single living organism, one that could learn, adapt, and replace itself faster than the enemy could react. The Zero had been born from perfection. The Hellcat was born from progress, and progress, once it starts, doesn't stop for anyone. When the sun rose over the Pacific after those first great clashes, the difference was written across the clouds. The smoke trails no longer curved gracefully in tight spirals. They cut straight lines, brutal, decisive, final. In those lines lay the future of air combat. And for the men who once laughed at the idea of a flying tank, there was only one truth left to face. The war had moved beyond them. The sword had met the factory, and the factory had won. By mid-1944, the Pacific skies had become a graveyard for the Imperial Japanese Navy's finest. The legends who once ruled the air now faced a new kind of war, one that couldn't be fought with instinct or courage alone. Each encounter with the Hellcat left fewer survivors to tell the story. The once proud Zero, symbol of Japanese supremacy, was now a silhouette vanishing in flames. The pilots who had trained for years were gone, replaced by boys with only weeks of experience, sent into cockpits that had become coffins. On the morning of June 19, 1944, the Japanese Navy prepared for what they believed would be their redemption, the decisive battle that would restore their honor. They called it Operation Ago. The Americans would remember it as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Imperial fleet launched wave after wave of aircraft, more than 400 fighters, bombers and torpedo planes, rising from their carriers like a dark storm. But hundreds of miles away, aboard American ships, radar operators had already spotted them. Calm voices echoed across radio channels. Bogies bearing 270, Angels 25. Hellcats scramble. Within minutes, the sky over the Philippine Sea filled with blue-gray shapes climbing toward the sun. The Hellcats moved in perfect formations, climbing higher and higher until they could see the sunlight flashing off Japanese canopies far below. Then came the command, Angels 25. Engage at will. The first wave of Japanese aircraft broke formation, diving toward the fleet. It was supposed to be a coordinated assault, bombers protected by Zero escorts, but it dissolved into chaos almost instantly. The Hellcats fell upon them from above, diving at speeds the Zero could never reach. The American pilots called it high-side runs. One burst, one pass, then a zoom climb back to altitude. They didn't stay to dogfight. They struck like lightning, vanished, and struck again. Within minutes, the sky became a storm of fire. The Japanese pilots tried to turn, tried to find their rhythm, but the Hellcats refused to fight their style of war. They climbed when the Zeros turned. They dove when the Zeros climbed. The radio chatter turned desperate, a chaos of voices calling warnings, positions, prayers. Then silence. Out of 69 Japanese planes in the first wave, 42 were gone in less than 15 minutes. When the second and third waves came, the results were the same. Radar had given the Americans something Japan could never match: time. Every incoming attack was intercepted before it even reached the fleet. Hellcat divisions met them head-on, their formation so dense it looked like a wall of metal moving through the sky. By the end of the day, the sea below was littered with wreckage. Flames floated on the water like oil lanterns. The Americans had lost barely 30 planes. The Japanese had lost more than $350. The battle that was meant to save the empire instead destroyed its air arm forever. Out of hundreds of Japanese pilots who took off that morning, only a handful ever returned. It was the end of the elite, the final curtain for the samurai of the sky. Those who made it back to their carriers sat in stunned silence. Some refused to leave their cockpits. Others wept openly. Their commander, Admiral Ozawa, sent one final, heartbreaking message to headquarters. The enemy's radar-guided fighters have achieved the impossible. They have industrialized air combat. For the Americans, it was a turning point. On the decks of their carriers, pilots joked, calling it a turkey shoot. But behind the laughter was something else: disbelief. They had seen what industrial power could do. The Hellcat wasn't just a machine anymore. It was the symbol of a nation that had mastered the art of war through organization, precision, and relentless production. A few months later came the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in human history. Once again, the Hellcats led the way. The Japanese launched desperate counterattacks, filling the sky with planes that carried more hope than skill. In that chaos, one man would etch his name into history: Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's ace of aces. On October 24, 1944, McCampbell and his wingman spotted a formation of more than 60 Japanese aircraft heading straight for the fleet. He didn't hesitate. 7 Hellcats went up to meet them. The battle lasted 90 minutes, a whirlwind of fire, smoke, and steel. McCampbell shot down 9 enemy planes himself, 5 Zeros and 4 bombers, while his wingman, Roy Rushing, destroyed 6 more. 15 enemy aircraft were wiped from the sky without a single American loss. McCampbell returned to his carrier out of ammunition, his plane riddled with holes. He had rewritten history that day: 2 ace-in-a-day performances, unmatched in naval aviation. But for every victory, the Japanese despair grew deeper. After Leyte Gulf, the surviving pilot spoke of something new: not just fear, but paralysis. They called it Hellcat psychosis. Men who had once been fearless now hesitated to engage, haunted by the memory of those blue-gray machines appearing out of the sun. Admiral Ozawa's post-battle report put it simply, "We are no longer fighting pilots. We are fighting a system. The Hellcat is not a plane. It is a machine of machines." The training programs collapsed completely. With fuel gone and aircraft scarce, Japan resorted to the unthinkable, sending barely trained boys on one-way missions. The kamikaze had been born. Vice Admiral Onishi justified it in cold arithmetic. If one pilot in 10 can crash into a ship, it is better than losing all 10 to Hellcats. They turned desperation into doctrine, courage into suicide. The first missions were launched in late October 1944, and the men who volunteered were told they would save the Empire. What they didn't know was that they were already its funeral procession. The Hellcats became the shield against this storm of death. Off Okinawa, the skies burned for weeks. Kamikaze planes dove in waves, hundreds at a time. But the Hellcats met them head-on. Pilots like Eugene Valencia developed new tactics, flying in sweeping formations called the mowing machine. 4 Hellcats side by side, 100 yards apart, cutting through enemy formations in synchronized bursts of fire. "We'd make one pass," Valencia said later, "then climb back to altitude and do it again." It was mechanical, efficient, and devastating. During the Okinawa campaign alone, Hellcats flew more than 38,000 combat sorties. They destroyed over 2,300 enemy aircraft for the loss of only 249. They stopped nearly 80% of suicide planes before they ever reached the fleet. The kill ratio stood at 9-1, and that was against pilots who had nothing left to lose. By now, Japan's factories were silent. Its once mighty airfields were nothing but craters and twisted steel. And yet, even in defeat, there was a strange sense of awe among the few who survived. Pilots who once laughed at the Hellcat's bulk now spoke of it with something like reverence. Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous ace who had mocked the aircraft in 1943, faced it himself in battle. After surviving that encounter, he wrote in his diary, "I performed every maneuver I had ever learned. Loops, rolls, dives. The Hellcat followed every move. I lived only because the American pilot made a mistake." He would later call the Hellcat a masterpiece of war, an aircraft that didn't just win battles but ended an era, the age of the individual warrior. The Zero had been built on the spirit of the samurai. The Hellcat was built on the power of the factory, and no matter how skilled the swordsman, the machine always wins. As 1945 dawned, the truth was undeniable. The Hellcat had achieved what no other aircraft had ever done, complete domination. In just 2 years, it had destroyed more than 5,200 enemy aircraft while losing fewer than 300 in aerial combat. It produced over 300 American aces. It became responsible for 75% of all U.S. Navy aerial victories in the Pacific. The Japanese air arm, once the pride of the empire, was gone. Out of 18,000 naval aviators who started the war, fewer than 100 remained alive and combat-ready. The world of aerial combat had been rewritten, not by the fastest plane or the most elegant, but by the one that was built for war, for endurance, for the survival of those who flew it. The Hellcat wasn't just the machine that ended Japan's air dominance. It was the sound of industrial power roaring through the clouds, a reminder that in total war, numbers, systems, and precision outweigh courage alone. And somewhere in the silence after the last battle, even the surviving Japanese pilots understood it. Their courage hadn't failed them. Their faith hadn't failed them. Their philosophy had. The Hellcat had been the mirror that showed them the truth, that the future belonged not to the lone warrior, but to the nation that could build 1,000 of them every hour. August 1945. The Pacific skies, once filled with the thunder of war, were quiet now. The smoke had settled over ruined islands, the airfields lay silent, and Japan's proud air fleets were nothing but twisted metal. For years, their pilots had believed themselves invincible, warriors born of discipline and spirit. But now even the most devoted among them understood the truth. The skies no longer belonged to the samurai, they belonged to the machines. And at the heart of that transformation stood one name: the Hellcat. At Atsugi Airfield, the last stronghold of Japanese naval aviation, the men who had once mocked, the American fighter stood watching as a dozen blue-gray Hellcats from USS Yorktown descended through the clouds. The roar of their engines echoed across the shattered hangars like the sound of judgment. For the first time, Japanese pilots saw the aircraft that had haunted their nightmares up close. They touched its armor, its thick fuselage, its massive engine, and realized just how far behind they had fallen. One engineer whispered, "It looks like it was carved from steel." Another, unable to look away, muttered, "No wonder we never stood a chance." Lieutenant Robert Vauss, one of the arriving American pilots, climbed down from his cockpit and smiled politely at the crowd of defeated airmen. Through an interpreter, he said, "You have to understand, this isn't even pushing it. In combat with full boost, it's 20% more powerful." Then he performed a short demonstration flight: rolls, loops, vertical climbs. Each maneuver seemed to mock the myth that the Hellcat was too heavy to fight. When he landed, there was silence. One Japanese pilot simply bowed his head and said, "We laughed at it because we did not understand it." After the surrender, Japanese engineers began to examine captured Hellcats in detail. What they found left them speechless. Every component was precision-built. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine contained thousands of interchangeable parts. Any one of them could fit perfectly into any other engine off the production line. The Japanese Nakajima Sakai engine, by contrast, had to be hand-fitted. No two were identical. Every Zero was slightly different, a masterpiece of craftsmanship. But war doesn't reward art. War rewards repetition. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, the man who had designed the legendary Zero, studied the Hellcat and finally admitted the truth. "We designed an aircraft for 1941. They designed an aircraft system for 1945. While we perfected the sword, they built the factory." Those words became Japan's quiet eulogy for its lost empire. In Bethpage, New York, the Grumman factory never slept. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, thousands of men and women worked under fluorescent light assembling aircraft at a pace the world had never seen. At its peak, a brand new Hellcat rolled off the line every hour. In just 30 months, they built 12,275 fighters. The Japanese couldn't comprehend it. They had produced barely 5,000 aircraft of all types in the same period. For every Zero that took off, 6 Hellcats were waiting for it. It wasn't a contest anymore, it was a flood. And it wasn't just quantity. Every one of those planes was the product of a national effort. Workers followed color-coded instructions, parts moved along assembly lines on conveyor belts, inspectors checked every bolt with military precision. Each plane left the factory identical to the last, capable of being repaired anywhere in the world because every part would fit every other. That was the secret Japan never cracked: the power of standardization. The Hellcat didn't just change battles, it changed strategy itself. Before its arrival, carriers were seen as fragile weapons, ships that struck fast and then retreated before enemy counterattack. The Hellcat turned them into floating fortresses. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58, understood the shift. He said, "With the Hellcat, we don't need to find them first, let them come." His confidence wasn't arrogance, it was math. A fleet guarded by hundreds of Hellcats was untouchable. With that strength, American carriers roamed freely across the Pacific, parking off enemy coastlines for weeks at a time. Every Japanese airfield within range was annihilated. Every convoy that dared to move by daylight was attacked. Japan's once formidable navy could no longer leave port. The empire had built its war machine on the idea that spirit could overcome steel. The Hellcat proved that steel, when forged by millions of free hands, is unstoppable. But behind every number, every victory, there was a human face. The pilots who flew those missions were young, barely out of their teens. They painted shark mouths and pin-ups on their fuselages, carried Lucky Charms in their flight suits, and talked about home between sorties. Many never came back. Yet they knew what they were part of, something larger than themselves. Each time they throttled up, and the deck fell away beneath them, they carried the weight of an entire nation's hope. On the other side, the remaining Japanese aviators faced a different kind of burden. They had been told they were the descendants of warriors who could never be defeated. Now they were being ordered to die in one-way missions, turning their aircraft into weapons. In their final letters home, some still wrote proudly, believing their sacrifice would save their families. Others wrote only one line: "I go now because I have nothing else to give." When the war finally ended, the contrast between these two worlds was unbearable. America had emerged from the conflict stronger than ever, its factories humming, its people united, its skies filled with the machines that had won the war. Japan, meanwhile, lay in ruins, its cities burned, its pilots gone, its faith in invincibility shattered. And in that silence, the truth of the Hellcat's triumph became clear. It had done more than destroy enemy planes. It had destroyed an entire philosophy. For centuries, Japan had believed that honor, discipline, and sacrifice were the ultimate weapons. The Hellcat proved that in modern war, those virtues mean nothing without the power to sustain them. It wasn't courage that won the Pacific. It was capability. The fighter that Japan had laughed at him, that fat, slow, ugly machine, had turned out to be the perfect predator. Years later, at a symposium of American and Japanese veterans, former enemies sat together, old men now, remembering the battles that had defined their youth. Captain David McCampbell, America's top Navy ace, said simply, "The Hellcat won the Pacific Air War." Commander Saburo Sakai, the legend of Japan, nodded quietly and replied, "The Zero was a better fighter. The Hellcat was a better weapon. We never understood the difference until it was too late. We brought swords to a gunfight." In the years that followed, the world would remember the Hellcat not for its beauty, but for its purpose. It had rewritten the laws of aerial warfare. It had proven that innovation and industry could be mightier than tradition and pride. And in doing so, it had ushered in a new age, one where the outcome of wars would no longer be decided by the bravest men, but by the smartest machines and the nations that built them. By the time Saburo Sakai died in 2000, he had lived long enough to see Japan and the United States become allies, their skies shared by commercial jets instead of bombers. In his final interview, he was asked what the Hellcat meant to him. His answer was as honest as it was haunting. "The Zero made Japan dream of greatness. The Hellcat made us wake up." He paused, his voice softening. "Every Japanese pilot who survived did so because an American chose not to kill him. That is the greatest defeat of all, to exist only because your enemy allowed it." The Hellcat had started as a joke, an overweight, over-engineered brute that Japan dismissed without a second thought. But it ended as the instrument that erased an empire's illusion of superiority. It had not only won the air war, it had proven the future belonged to those who could adapt, innovate, and produce on a scale never seen before. As the last surviving Hellcats were retired from service, their engines silenced and their wings folded forever, they left behind a legacy written not in glory, but in cold, undeniable truth. Strength is not in myth, it's in mastery. Victory belongs not to the loudest boast, but to the quiet hum of a factory that never stops. And somewhere, in that vast silence where the Zero once ruled, the ghost of every pilot who ever doubted the Hellcat would understand. It wasn't just an airplane. It was the end of an era, the beginning of another, and the last laugh of a machine that turned the tide of history.